Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, Books, Gurrs, and Purrs. My name's Leslie, and today we're going to be discussing Giovanni's Room, written by James Baldwin. It was first issued in 1956. Gosh, where do I start? This book was such an emotional read. I'll tell you right off the bat. I did love this. I do recommend it. But I'm starting to think that every single book of that I read of James Baldwin is going to be an emotional juggernaut and leave me with an emotional hangover. Alright, so Giovanni's Room is about David. That's the lens that we're seeing the story through. He's an American. He decides to leave home. He was raised by a father that's an alcoholic, and I think as David grows up, he sees that he doesn't want to repeat what his father has been doing with his life. So this is indicated by the fact that David at some point gets in a bad accident, and he sees that he's starting to become an alcoholic like his father. So he just gathers money, takes off to France, and decides to just get away from his problems, run away from his problems in a way. So here he is, an American expat in Paris, France. He doesn't really have any money. He has his own friends that he has there, and he falls in love with a bartender named Giovanni. In the meantime, while this is going on, when he initially leaves, I believe, he leaves his girlfriend and potential fiance behind. Her name is Hella. And so the focus is really on excuse me, him and Giovanni, and how they have this like very intense, engrossing in each other relationship, very codependent, and what happens from there, right? So that's the synopsis. I enjoy this book. It's also just really exploring not just sexuality, but gender identity. I'd say even like national identity. That definitely comes into the conversation, because once the character David leaves America, he's thrown into France, and then like how do you view yourself, right? Or how do people view you and your identity once you've left, let's say, your country? And so that comes into play. There's definitely other conversations in this book about like guilt, shame, love, and what is home for yourself. And I want to say that that was actually explored in a previous book. So maybe this is something that the author continues to explore in each book. But yeah, I found it really beautiful and really sad. And oh, I'm sorry, I felt like sneezing. So yeah, there's just a lot of also like internalized homophobia in a way. Look up trigger warnings. Also, there's a lot of like misogyny, I guess, that I'll definitely talk about it in the spoiler portion. But going into the misogyny, I felt like when I was reading something in here, I'll just say this. I felt like just because an author writes these things doesn't mean he agrees with them. And so that's how I felt about this work. I felt like there's casual talk about violence against women, and I don't think it's because it's something that the author agrees with. I think it's quite the opposite. I'm under the impression that this is something that the author must have had witnessed and felt like it's so prevalent in several different communities. So I felt like I'm gonna write this in, and I appreciate that kind of writing. There's another author, Amezi, I think, that writes stories in a way of, this is just what happened. I'm not gonna deal with consequence. I would rather the reader read this and then have a conversation about what goes on in the book. And so that's how I kind of felt about it. But that's basically like my non-spoiler talk about this. I'm trying to think about what else I could add. I will add that, once again, the author really has a knack for imagery, and I just appreciate the way that he writes, because the way that this author writes, I get sucked in every single time. It's really incredibly beautiful. I was trying to think of a quote I could use, and so on page 75, I think, at the beginning of part 2, the author writes, "I remember that life in that room seemed to be occurring beneath the sea. Time flowed past indifferently above us. Hours and days had no meaning. In the beginning, our life together held a joy and amazement which was newborn every day. Beneath the joy, of course, was anguish, and beneath the amazement was fear. But they did not work themselves to the beginning until our high beginning was aloes on our tongues." And so the author just writes so beautifully, and really sucks you in almost to the intense romance and feelings that the character David and Giovanni have for each other. And also, like, almost like the sacred space that they have together in Giovanni's room. And so I thought that was really beautiful. But that's the end for my non-spoiler talk. And so I'm going to go into spoiler territory. So if you haven't read it yet, you don't want to watch this portion. I'm trying to figure out where to put this. Let me set this aside. I'm going to have to look at my notes because there's no way I'm going to remember everything that I want to talk about. Alright, so something that I want to talk about is that the character Giovanni is someone that is not mentally in a good space. And that's apparent right away from the beginning. And something else that the author carves out for Giovanni is that he's someone that's been used in the past. And so I think that because homophobia is so prevalent, Giovanni gets put into the cycle of wanting to be loved and then being discarded. And so ultimately, David ends up being one of those people. David is someone that ends up caring very intensely for Giovanni, but then does the same thing that's happened to Giovanni before. So there's that cycle of like internalized homophobia that's going on. I mean, they get to a point in the relationship where they're like on the cusp of being like violent towards each other. And I really think that speaks to self-hatred. It's just like really unhealthy and sad to read about. Something else about David, I feel like he's conflicted, and that brings up thoughts about like his upbringing, right? He's just ran away from home in a way to get away from whatever like the social conventions are expected of him. You know, he wants to break the cycle of like not being an alcoholic, but I feel like he's still repeating the cycle anyways. He's still in a relationship where he treats someone really poorly, and even though he has this fiance from afar, and he knows that the person that he would rather be with in a way is Giovanni, he can't escape that framework, right? Of, I need to get married, this is what I want. And so I think in David's mind, he thinks that's legitimately what he wants. That's what he could picture for himself. He wants to be married. he wants to have a conventional family and have kids. But I often feel like when I'm reading this, he has a longing for those conventions because it's too scary for him to be vulnerable and to even imagine something else for himself outside of the cultural expectations as an American, if that makes any sense. That's how I took it. Something else in this book that's also really like beautiful and sad and disturbing all at the same time, which I didn't mark. I didn't mark the page. I could kick myself. Is that when Giovanni and David are living in Giovanni's room, they have very little means, and so David's staying with Giovanni. They kind of like wide out the window of their space, and I felt like that symbolizes a lot of things. They could be completely themselves, let everything go in that room, but they don't want the outside world to see what they're doing. And also, I can't remember if it's like white paint or white chalk or what it was, but because it's white, I felt like maybe that's a symbol of like Christian purity, or like all the expectations, everything in there is divided by that paint between themselves and the outside world. And so I found that to be incredibly deep and sad, because they're only living their truth through the confines of like these four walls, right? And so yeah, it's just a constant bummer. And so when I'm viewing this relationship, there's just so much unhealthy behavior attached to the relationship, especially on Giovanni's part. He's just someone that's very fragile and needy, but I also don't blame Giovanni. Again, I think this comes from a place of just constantly being used by others to where they're not in a good place, very fragile mental state. So as Giovanni gets more and more attached to David, there's this impending doom of David knowing he is going to leave him and trying to find out the right words to say it, because he can't let go of wanting to fulfill the ideology of being married and having kids. And so I feel like it's this need to follow what he thinks is the right path that ultimately destroys so many like different parts of his life. He tells Hela, hey, this is what I want to marry you, let's get out of here. He's just so quick to rid himself of the relationship he's had with Giovanni. And so in doing so, eventually Hela figures it out. She knows something up. And how she doesn't even like David's friend. They're all very chauvinistic, and she catches on to that. And something that she talks through her character, which I think brings up gender roles, not just through David's eyes, but her eyes as well. She talks about the conventions of marriage, about how it's been used to like oppress women, and yet she also wants to be a part of that system. She says it in a more beautiful way, and what I notice is that us as a reader, we're hearing her say this, but David's not really understanding her. And so I found that really interesting, because here he is willing to marry this woman for what he thinks he wants, and then also throwing away someone else. It's all very messy by the end of it. And in so doing, they end up staying in Paris a little bit longer than they expected. And when he ends things with Giovanni, Giovanni just becomes so heartbroken, and that's what really makes him snap. So Giovanni ends up, by the end of this book, murdering someone. And, you know, this is a spoiler chat, so of course, you know, this happened, but this whole time in the book, what I kept being concerned about is I didn't want to read the book and find out that Giovanni killed himself. Because from the very beginning, that's what I thought was going to happen. So I'm glad it didn't play out like that. But Giovanni and David, actually not Giovanni, David not being able to accept himself and doing what he did really destroys several lives. It destroys Hella. You know, she could still kind of go on with her life, but he's really like put her through the ringer. And then Giovanni essentially snaps, right? And so by the end of it, David is just left alone. And there's this moment in the book, and it's the way the book ends that was so beautiful, was how David basically is like thinking he's going to let go of all these different facets of his life. And he rips up a letter from one of his friends that he used to hang out with. And when he leaves, the wind brings all these different pieces floating back to him. And I thought that was really beautiful. Something else that I wanted to bring up that I thought didn't really get explored in other, I guess, reviews is just how at some point in the book, David says something like, referring to him being an American, and how other people, let's say Giovanni will say in a positive light, oh, you're not really an American. But then when Giovanni wants to insult the character, he'll say, you're such an American, you know. But with that said, all at the same time, the character David also feels like, well, if he doesn't have his American identity, then he's nobody. And I think that's such a large and sad thing to think about, that his identity is so ingrained based on a place that he was born, or like his citizenship somewhere, that he thinks he's nothing without it. I thought that that's very heavy, and it's saying a lot, right? And I wonder if this is somehow a reflection of how maybe the author felt when he was living abroad. It's something to think about. Either way, I love this book, but again, it was really tumultuous, and I think at some point I'm going to have to read like a really cheesy, over-the-top romance to make up for this. But if you read the book Giovanni's Room, let me know what you think about it. I know that there's like a lot of chauvinistic moments, or, you know, talks about violence against women, and again, I don't think that was something that the author agreed with. I think he's just speaking to a culture, and I definitely feel that way, especially with the character of Hilla having a voice in this. Yeah, I really love this book. I mean, I really feel like James Baldwin is really spoiling me and ruining my experiences with other authors, because I don't think anyone could really hold a candle to the way that he writes. So that's all I could think of to say about this, and I guess I'll see you later.